Imagine an army of 15,000 soldiers returning home. But instead of joyful shouts, all you hear is the shuffling of thousands of feet and a low, whining drone. They do not look at their king because they have nothing to look with. This is the most terrifying act of intimidation in the history of the Middle Ages, committed by a man who decided that being effective was more important than being merciful. In this video, we will tell the story of Basil II, a man who went from being a humiliated, frightened boy, laughed at by the entire world, to the ruthless Bulgar-Slayer. How did it happen that he sold his own sister to a barbarian for the sake of power? Why did he start a war against his own elite, making the rich weep tears of blood? And how did his greatest triumph, which turned Byzantium into a superpower, become the cause of its inevitable and nightmarish demise? You will learn why a perfect dictatorship is a ticking time bomb, and why the empire's golden age ended the very second the lid of this lonely old man's sarcophagus closed. Watch until the end to understand why the victor who won every battle ultimately lost the war against history itself. Imagine standing in the middle of a vast plain, but instead of fresh autumn air, your lungs are burned by the sickening sweet smell of charred flesh and dried blood. It is October of the year 1014, the Balkans. You are at the epicenter of the worst crime in medieval history, yet it is surprisingly quiet here. There is no clashing of swords, no furious battle cries, no heroic speeches. There is only a monotonous humming, like the sound of a giant hive, and an endless, maddening shuffling. The shuffling of 30,000 feet that no longer know where to step. Look at them. This is not just a defeated army. It is a living monument to human cruelty. 15,000 captured Bulgarian soldiers. 15,000 strong men, fathers, husbands, sons. Just yesterday they were King Samuel's elite, the steel fist threatening Constantinople. Today, they are nobodies. They kneel in the mud, waiting their turn for the surgeon. Emperor Basil II did not execute them. Execution is mercy. Execution is quick. And Basil did not want to be merciful. He wanted to be effective. He sat on his campaign throne, watching the process with the cold, fish-like calm of an accountant reconciling an annual report. Killing 15,000 people is a logistical problem. Corpses need to be buried, or a plague will start. Corpses do not tell stories. Corpses do not instill terror. But 15,000 blind cripples. That is no longer an army. That is an economic bomb. Imagine this cynical calculation. The Emperor of Byzantium, God's vice-regent on earth, devised a punishment that makes blood run cold even 1,000 years later. He ordered them all to be blinded. Every single one. But Basil was a sophisticated sadist. He understood that a blind mob would simply perish in the ravines without reaching home. And they had to reach home. They had to become a message. So he introduced a devilish arithmetic. 99 men were deprived of both eyes completely, plunged into eternal darkness, while the 100th, the lucky one, was left with one eye. One single eye to see this hell and lead his 99 comrades. Just think about the psychology of this decision. The one who was half pardoned was doomed to eternally watch the suffering of those he led. It was not just a massacre of bodies, it was the dismemberment of a national soul. The operation lasted several days. Smoking braziers, red-hot iron rods, a smell that turned the stomachs of even veterans used to guts on the battlefield. The conveyor belt of horror worked without a hitch. Next, strike, scream, darkness. Next, it was a bureaucracy of pain. Scribes likely ticked boxes on scrolls, accounting for the consumption of coal and iron. And when the last soldier was turned into a helpless invalid, Basil waved his hand. "Go to your king," he seemed to say. "Let him feed you. Let him look at you." And they walked. Imagine this procession, the grisliest march in human history. A snake made of human bodies stretching for miles along mountain roads. They walked, hands on the shoulders of the man in front, stumbling over stones, falling into the mud, rising to the shouts of the one-eyed guides. If one fell, the whole chain fell. The winter wind was already starting to bite their faces, snow packing into empty sockets, but they kept walking. It was a procession of the dead whose throats they forgot to slit. Locals in the villages through which this army passed locked their shutters and prayed for this nightmare to pass them by. The sight of these people was more terrifying than any plague. They were living proof that Byzantium is not gold and silk. Byzantium is steel and darkness. Meanwhile, in Prilep, at his residence, King Samuel waited for news. The old lion, who had frayed the empire's nerves for decades, knew the battle was lost, but he hoped to save at least his people. He hoped for ransom, for an exchange, for the usual rules of war. He did not know that Basil had cancelled all the rules. And then, the sentries on the walls shouted. Dust appeared in the distance. "They are coming! They are returning!" Thousands of soldiers. At first, the king probably sighed with relief. Alive. Defeated, perhaps, but alive. An army can be reformed, given weapons, thrown back into battle. Samuel went out to meet his sons. But as the column approached, joy turned to bewilderment. Why are they walking so strangely? Why are they holding on to each other like drunks? Why is it so quiet? No welcoming shouts, no songs, only shuffling and a low, whining drone. And when the first ranks approached the gates, when Samuel looked into the face of the lead guide and then shifted his gaze to those following behind, reality hit him harder than a battering ram. He saw a sea of empty, healing wounds instead of eyes. Thousands of black holes staring into nowhere. 15,000 blind men stared at their king without seeing him. And in that moment, the great warrior who had survived dozens of battles broke. It wasn't a heart attack. It was a heart rupture from an overdose of pure, concentrated grief. Samuel collapsed to the ground like a felled oak. 2 days later, he died. Basil II didn't just defeat the enemy army. He killed the enemy leader without laying a finger on him. He killed the hope of an entire nation, turning its defenders into a burden. Bulgaria, as an independent state, ceased to exist the moment the first blind soldier crossed the threshold of the royal palace. It was a triumph of absolute will and absolute evil. Basil received the nickname the Bulgar-Slayer, which would echo through the centuries like the scream of 15,000 martyrs. But ask yourself, who do you have to be to commit such a thing? Are monsters born, or are they forged by circumstances? After all, this icy executioner, capable of coldly ordering a mass blinding, was not always this way. Once, he was completely different. To understand the nature of this darkness, we need to erase the picture of triumph. We need to forget about greatness and gold. We need to rewind time 30 years, back to where Basil was not the Bulgar-Slayer, but a frightened, humiliated youth laughed at by the whole world. Back to a mountain gorge piled with Byzantine corpses where his character was forged. A character cast from shame and hatred. The story of his rise begins not with a victory. It begins with a catastrophic, shameful failure that almost cost him his life and his throne. with the moment fate shoved his face into the mud at the gates of Trajan. Wipe from your memory the image of the stern old man with the icy gaze. Forget the Bulgar-Slayer. Let's transport ourselves to August of the year 986. Before us is a completely different person. He is 28 years old, but politically, he is an infant wrapped in purple. The Basil II we see now is a chubby, pampered prince raised in the gilded cage of the great palace. All his life he has been a puppet. First he was controlled by his mother, Theophano, a woman with a reputation as a poisoner. Then a parade of usurpers who slept with his mother and wore his crown. Now the powerful eunuch Basil II, his great-uncle, practically holds the empire in his manicured hands. The young emperor is suffocating. He wants to prove he is not just a decoration on the throne. He needs a small, victorious war. The classic mistake of all insecure rulers. And the target seems perfect: Bulgaria. The very Bulgaria the Byzantines already considered almost their own province, but which suddenly snapped back under the leadership of the Komatopuli brothers. Basil gathers an army. The veterans frown. The generals, who have been through fire and water, advise him to wait, to prepare, not to go into the mountains without reconnaissance. But would someone who believes God personally guides his hand listen? Basil brushes off the advice. He craves the glory of Alexander the Great, but for now possesses only the ambitions of a capricious child. The campaign turns into a farce from the very first days. Picture the scene. A huge, clumsy army burdened with baggage trains of imperial junk, silk tents, gold tableware, a wardrobe. They drag themselves towards Serdica, modern-day Sofia. The heat is unbearable. The August sun melts brains under helmets. The Byzantines besiege the city, but they do it incompetently. Siege engines are burned by the Bulgarians. Foragers disappear in the forests. Grumbling begins in the camp. 20 days of senseless standing under the walls. 20 days of disgrace. Basil realizes there will be no victory. He gives the order to retreat. And that is when the real nightmare begins. The army enters a narrow mountain gorge known as Trajan's Gate. It is the perfect place for murder. Mountain slopes hang over the road, blocking out the sky. The Byzantines walk in a stretched-out column, tired, angry, demoralized. They are thinking of home, of cool wine, of baths. They do not look up. But up there, they are waiting. The signal to attack was likely the sound of hundreds of rocks simultaneously breaking loose. The Bulgarians did not fight in an open field. They simply brought the mountains down on the invaders' heads. With a wild howl that made blood run cold, the warriors of Samuel and his brother Aaron poured down the slopes like an avalanche. The organized retreat instantly turned into a panicked flight. The famous Byzantine discipline, the pride of the empire, evaporated in seconds. Imagine this chaos. A narrow path clogged with people and horses, the screams of the wounded, the neighing of maddened horses, the crunch of breaking spears and bones. No one listens to orders. Every man for himself. The elite heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, the pride of the army, trample their own infantry trying to escape the stone trap. The dust is so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face. In this hell, the Emperor of Byzantium, the Vicar of Christ, turns into a frightened animal. His guard, a detachment of Armenian infantry, literally paves a way for him with their bodies, hacking at anyone who hinders the escape. Friend or foe, it doesn't matter. Basil abandons everything. He abandons the imperial tent embroidered with gold. He abandons the treasury carried for paying wages. He abandons his personal luggage. The Bulgarians capture the imperial insignia, symbols of power sacred to any Roman. This is not just a defeat. It is a slap in the face heard from Baghdad to Rome. The emperor fled, saving his own skin, while his soldiers were slaughtered like cattle. When Basil reached Philippopolis, he was pathetic, dirty, shaking, with wild eyes. But the worst awaited him not in the mountains, but in Constantinople. The city met him with a silence that was louder than any curse. The aristocracy, the military elite, the Phocas and Skleros clans looked at him with barely concealed contempt. For them, hereditary warriors, losing the banner and abandoning the army was an indelible disgrace. Poisonous verses began to circulate through the capital. The poet John Geometres wrote an epitaph for Byzantine honor. The Ister captured the crown of Rome. Gauls, Scythians, all nations attack, for the walls that guarded us have fallen. It was in these days, in the gloomy corridors of the palace, while eunuchs whispered behind his back and taverns laughed at the runaway emperor, that the old Basil died. The boy who dreamed of easy glory burned in the shame of Trajan's gate. In his place, something else began to form. Cold, hard, devoid of emotion. He realized one simple and terrible thing. No one respects him. To the nobility, he is an upstart and a weakling. To the people, a loser. He locked himself in his chambers. He stopped sleeping. At night he paced the empty halls, and every step echoed in his head with the words, "Never again." Never again will he trust advisors. Never again will he allow luxury to cloud his reason. Never again will he be ridiculous. He grew to hate the aristocracy that betrayed him with their mockery. He grew to hate the Bulgarians who humiliated him. This hatred became the fuel for his transformation. He gave up wine. He gave up women. He gave up literature and art, which was so loved in Byzantium. All of that is distracting husk. Only one goal remained: absolute power and absolute revenge. But to take revenge on external enemies, one must first survive inside one's own home. After all, the scent of blood was picked up not only by the Bulgarians. Sharks inside the empire began to circle the throne. The great generals Bardas Skleros and Bardas Phocas, heroes of past wars, looked at the broken emperor and thought, "Why do we need this pathetic little boy? The throne should belong to the strong." The empire began to wobble. Rebellion festered like an abscess. Basil II was left alone against everyone. He had no loyal army. It had either perished or despised him. He had no allies among the elite. It seemed his days were numbered, and soon another lucky general would try on the purple shoes, stepping over the loser's corpse. But they underestimated one detail. In the fire of humiliation, Basil smelted a will within himself of such density that the best blades of the empire would soon break against it. And to save himself, he was ready to make a deal that would forever change the ethnic map of Europe and the fate of a distant northern country. He was ready to sell the most precious thing he had to barbarians, just to buy himself life and a sword. In his mind, a plan matured, cynical and brilliant, which would bring the most ferocious killers of that time to the walls of Constantinople. Look at this man. Look closely. Do you see in him that chubby youth who sobbed in the mud at Trajan's gate? No. That boy no longer exists. In the palace chambers of Constantinople, a ghost now lives. Basil II performed a vivisection on himself. He cut everything human out of his soul, leaving only raw function. He gave up soft beds and sleeps on a hard campaign cot. He stopped wearing a crown, replacing it with a simple helmet. Silk tunics were replaced by coarse wool that rubs the skin raw, reminding him of the price of weakness. He drinks no wine, looks at no women, listens to no poets. While the court sleeps, the emperor sits by the light of a single candle, reading not the Bible, but supply reports and treatises on tactics. He learns to count money and grain. He becomes a monk whose monastery is the barracks and whose prayer is the marching step. The courtiers are horrified. They are used to emperor partygoers, but they got an emperor calculator. But Basil has no choice. The empire is burning. Two giants, two of the greatest commanders of the era, Bardas Skleros and Bardas Phocas, decided that playtime was over. They raised a rebellion. This is not just a riot, it is a civil war tearing Byzantium in half. Phocas, the very man who looked at Basil as a misunderstanding, declared himself emperor. He has experience, he has charisma, legions follow him. And what does Basil have? Only the walls of Constantinople, and the stamp of legitimacy, which is rapidly losing value. He is cornered. He is a rat about to be crushed by a boot. And in this moment of absolute despair, Basil makes a decision that would make any conscience shudder. But he no longer has a conscience. He only has expediency. He needs brute force. Force unbound by the intrigues of the Roman nobility. He looks to the north. There, in distant Kiev, Prince Vladimir rules. A pagan, a barbarian, a savage in the eyes of the Byzantines. Basil sends envoys with a proposal that sounds like blasphemy. He is ready to give Vladimir his own sister. Just think about it. Anna is Porphyrogenita, born in the purple room of the palace, the daughter of an emperor. In the Byzantine table of ranks, she is a being of a higher order, almost a deity. To give her to a barbarian is not just a misalliance, it is political prostitution. It is a humiliation of imperial dignity. Anna cries. She begs her brother not to give her as a concubine to the northern beast, not to send her into the cold darkness of Scythia. But Basil looks at her with his new, dead eyes and says, "The empire requires it." He sells his own blood for 6,000 mercenaries. 6,000 Vikings. The deal of the century is done. And they sailed. In the winter of the year 988, longships entered the Golden Horn harbor, full of people Constantinople had never seen before. The Varangian Guard. Huge, fair-haired, smelling of stale alcohol and death. They carried axes the size of a man on their shoulders. For them, there was no politics, intrigue, or God. For them, there was only gold and an oath of loyalty to the one who pays. Basil got his perfect weapon. Loyal dogs who would tear out the throat of anyone the master pointed at. Because in this city, they had no other kin. The denouement came on April 13th, 989, near the city of Abydos. Bardas Phocas, confident in his victory, led his troops against the boy. He expected to see a trembling militia. Instead, he saw a wall of shields and a forest of axes. Basil personally led the attack. Imagine this moment. The emperor, who used to be afraid of his own shadow, now gallops in the front row, and next to him, roaring like demons, runs 6,000 northern berserkers. The battle turned into a slaughter. The Varangians didn't fence, they chopped. Heavy axes split shields, helmets, and skulls of the rebels like rotten pumpkins. The refined art of Byzantine combat shattered against the primal rage of the north. Phocas, seeing his army turning into ground meat, decided to end it all with one blow. He saw Basil. He spurred his horse, aiming to take the head of the hated upstart. It was a scene from an ancient tragedy, two riders rushing at each other amidst bloody chaos. But fate is an ironic lady. A few meters from the emperor, Bardas Phocas suddenly swayed in the saddle. He slid off his horse and collapsed to the ground. What was it? A heart attack? Poison given by a traitor before the battle? Or simply fear of the monster Basil had become? Historians argue to this day. But Basil didn't care about the reasons. He rode up to his dying enemy, not to hear his last words. He chopped off his head. Later, this head was sent to Constantinople and put on public display. The people looked and understood. The old world had collapsed. There are no more parties, no debates, no alternatives. There is only one emperor, and his hand is heavy. The rebellion was crushed with a cruelty that silenced even the boldest critics. The Varangians became Basil's personal shadow, his nightmare for enemies. Now that the throne under him stopped shaking, now that the silence of a graveyard, obedience, reigned inside the country, Basil II could finally turn to what had kept him awake for 3 years. He walked up to the map. His finger slid west to where the mountains touched the sky. Bulgaria. Samuel. The bill had not yet been paid. But now, Basil would not repeat the mistakes of his youth. No cavalry charges, no summer campaigns. He would change the very nature of war. He would violate the main taboo of medieval strategy. Usually, when the first snow falls, armies disperse to winter quarters to drink wine and wait for spring. But Basil decided that seasons no longer existed for him. He would turn winter into his weapon. And when snow covered the Balkans with a white shroud, he would dye that shroud red. The era of total war was beginning. In the Middle Ages, war was always a seasonal event, almost like the harvest. There was an unspoken but holy contract. In the spring, armies gather. In the summer, they plunder and seek a pitched battle. And in the autumn, when the roads turn to mud, everyone goes home. You can't fight in winter. In winter, passes are blocked with snow, horses break their legs on ice, and men die of pneumonia faster than from swords. It was a law of nature. But Basil II decided that the laws of nature no longer applied to him. He revolutionized warfare in a way that horrified contemporaries more than any heresy. He canceled winter. Imagine the horror of a Bulgarian sentry standing on a wall somewhere near Vidin in January. It's 20 degrees below zero. The wind from the mountains strips the skin from your face. He is wrapped in furs, confident he is in absolute safety, because no normal person would lead an army in such weather. And suddenly, out of the snowy veil, like ghosts, legions emerge. They walk silently, clad in iron that burns the skin like fire in the cold. This is not a raid. It is a methodical, cold invasion. Basil changed his tactics from a dice player to a boa constrictor. After the disgrace at Trajan's Gate, he realized seeking one decisive battle is a lottery, and he hates gambling. Instead, he chose a strategy of total suffocation. Year after year, season after season, without breaks for holidays or rest, the Byzantine death machine gnawed into the body of the Bulgarian kingdom. It was a war of attrition, of resources, nerves, and human material. The emperor did not try to bite off the snake's head immediately. He broke its vertebrae one by one. He entered valleys, burned crops, destroyed fortresses, and left, leaving behind scorched earth and famine. And when the Bulgarians tried to rebuild what was destroyed, he returned. Sudden strikes across frozen rivers became his calling card. What used to be natural barriers, the Danube, the Struma, now became highways for his cavalry. King Samuel, that old wolf, suddenly found that his role as predator had been taken away. Now he was the prey. Samuel darted around the Balkans, trying to plug holes in the defense, but Basil was everywhere and nowhere. The Byzantine army became omnipresent, and the most terrifying thing for enemies was who led this army. The emperor no longer sat in Constantinople sending out orders. He lived in the saddle. He spent 30 years on campaigns. Imagine the ruler of a superpower eating stale soldier's bread mixed with road dust and drinking foul water from a wineskin without grimacing. He slept in a tent blown through by all winds and wore a hair shirt under his armor. He was no longer a man, but a living symbol of war. He knew his officers by name. He knew the veterans by face. He personally inspected the ranks, checking if swords were sharp and shield straps were strong.
Try stealing money from the treasury, or supplying bad fodder when the emperor personally counts the sacks of grain. Corruption in the army, that eternal disease of Byzantium, vanished under fear of immediate and brutal reprisal. The soldiers worshipped him and feared him to trembling. They saw that he demanded the impossible from them, but did the same himself. When the emperor freezes in a snowdrift next to you, you have no right to complain about the cold. He raised a generation of iron men. Basil's army became a perfect instrument of destruction. It moved with incredible speed, maneuvered as a single organism, and struck with the precision of a sadistic surgeon. Bulgaria was bleeding out. The country's economy was collapsing. Peasants were afraid to sow grain because they knew the Romans would come and burn everything. Cities surrendered one by one, unable to withstand the endless pressure. It was a slow apocalypse. Samuel was aging. His strength was fading. He saw his kingdom, which he had fought so hard to win back and build, shrinking like shagreen leather. He tried to counterattack, tried to form alliances, but Basil systematically ground down any attempts at resistance. The Byzantine steamroller moved slowly, but it was unstoppable. By the end of the year 1013, the situation became critical. Samuel realized there was nowhere left to run. The strategy of maneuver warfare was lost because he simply ran out of space to maneuver. Something had to change. This flow of steel pouring from the south had to be stopped at any cost. And then Samuel decided on a desperate move. If he couldn't defeat Basil in the open field, he would force geography itself to fight for him. He chose the narrow gorge of Kleidion in the Balasika Mountains, a key artery through which the Byzantines penetrated the heart of his country. Samuel ordered a wall to be built, a grandiose wooden fortification blocking the entire valley from cliff to cliff. Moat, rampart, palisade, towers. He drove his best remaining troops there, about 15,000 men, and locked the gates. It was a trap. Samuel calculated that Basil, in his arrogance, would smash his forehead against this wall. He waited, and in the summer of 1014, Basil arrived. The emperor saw a dead end before him. A frontal attack on such fortifications in a narrow mountain pass meant guaranteed suicide, even for his iron legions. It seemed the war had reached a stalemate. Two old enemies froze opposite each other, separated by a wall of logs and hatred. The air in the gorge thickened with tension. The climax of a drama lasting 3 decades was approaching. July 1014. The heat in the Kleidion Gorge is such that the air shimmers, distorting the outlines of the rocks. It is not just summer, it is an inferno. The Byzantine army, that invincible steel snake, has run its head into a wall. Literally. King Samuel blocked the valley of the Strumica River with a powerful system of fortifications. Moats, palisades, stone towers, piles of ancient trees. A wooden cork tightly plugging the throat of the Balkans. Basil II looks at this obstacle and grinds his teeth. Dead end. Stalemate. His constrictor strategy failed. Samuel, that old fox, finally outplayed him, forcing the Byzantines to stop. To attack head-on is madness. The narrow space in front of the wall is swept by crossfire from archers and stone throwers. Any assault will turn into a meat grinder, where the Byzantines will just be meat. Days pass. Soldiers are exhausted by the heat and idleness. The camp begins to smell not of victory, but of dysentery and defeat. Bulgarians on the walls shout insults, confident in their invulnerability. They think they've caught God by the beard. They think the war is over. But they forgot who they are dealing with. Basil does not know how to retreat.
If the door is locked, he doesn't look for a key. He breaks the wall next to it. Or, in this case, climbs over the roof. The emperor gathers a war council. It is stifling in the tent. Generals are silent, averting their eyes. And then the strategist Nikephoros Xiphias steps forward. Remember this name. If Basil is the brain and will of the empire, then Xiphias in this moment became its hands and feet. He proposes a plan that reeks of suicide. While Basil distracts the Bulgarians with frontal attacks, simulating frenzied activity, Xiphias, with a detachment of elite soldiers, must achieve the impossible. Bypass the fortifications through the Balasica mountain range. Sound simple? Look at the map. Balasica is not hills. These are wild, sheer cliffs covered with dense forest, where even mountain goats break their legs. There are no paths there. There are no roads. To pass an army there in full gear, secretly, without fire, at night, this is a task for ghosts, not humans. But there is no other way. The operation begins. Basil remains in front of the wall. He performs a one-man show. Every day he sends soldiers to assault, makes noise, beats drums, forcing Samuel to keep all his forces on the walls. The Bulgarians laugh. "Look, the old fool is banging his head against the gates," they think. Samuel's entire attention is riveted to the front. He sees the imperial standard, he sees the cataphracts, he sees the dust. He does not see what is happening over his head. Meanwhile, a few kilometers south, a quiet feat is taking place. Nikephoros Xiphias's men are climbing up. Imagine this ascent. Night. Darkness so thick it seems you could cut it with a knife. Lighting torches is forbidden. Any light in the mountains would give them away completely. They go by touch. Soldiers in chainmail, with shields and swords, clamber over scree, clinging to tree roots, tearing their fingernails to blood. Horses are led by the bridle, hooves wrapped in rags so they don't clatter on stones. Silence is their only salvation. One wrong step, one falling rock, one neigh of a frightened horse, and they are corpses. The Bulgarians would simply pick them off from above like in a shooting gallery. It was a march on the edge of human capability. They did not walk on earth. They walked on the sky, balancing over an abyss. Muscles burned with fire, lungs burst from the thin air, but they kept climbing, spurred by fear of the emperor and lust for loot. On July 29th, 1014, at dawn, when the sun just began to gild the mountain peaks, Xiphias's detachment came out in the rear of the Bulgarian army. They looked down. Before them, in full view, lay Samuel's camp. Thousands of Bulgarian soldiers slept or lazily prepared for breakfast, confident in the absolute safety of their rear. They had not posted sentries on the mountainside because no one believed danger could come from there. It was a fatal mistake. Xiphias gave the signal, and the mountains screamed. The sudden roar of trumpets and the battle cry of the Byzantines crashing down from above acted on the Bulgarians like a lightning strike. Imagine their terror. The enemy, who should be in front of the wall, is suddenly behind you, right in your camp. Panic flared instantly, like dry brushwood doused in oil. "We are surrounded! Betrayal!
Run! These thoughts raced through the minds of thousands of people simultaneously. The formation crumbled. Warriors dropped weapons, knocked each other down, trying to escape. At that moment, Basil, hearing the agreed signal, struck from the front. Now, for real. He smashed through the gates that no one was defending anymore. The walls Samuel had built for months turned into a trap for his own army. The Bulgarians were caught in a vice.
From the front, Basil's heavy cavalry. From the rear, Xiphias's enraged cutthroats descending from the mountains. The Kleidion gorge turned into a slaughterhouse. It was not a battle. It was an extermination. People crushed each other in the stampede. The Strumica River turned brown. Bodies piled on top of each other, forming new barricades, now of meat and bone. King Samuel, the old commander, tried to organize resistance, shouted orders, waved his sword, but his voice drowned in the wail of a dying army. He was saved only by a miracle and his son's devotion. Gavril Radomir literally dragged his father out of the scrum, put him on his horse, and sent him to the fortress of Prelude. Samuel fled, leaving behind on the battlefield not just soldiers. He left there the future of his state. When the dust settled, Basil II stood in the middle of the Valley of Death. Around him lay mountains of corpses and thousands of prisoners. 14 or 15,000 men. Almost the entire male population of fighting age. The victory was total. Absolute. Bulgaria, as an organized military force, ceased to exist in one day. The emperor looked at the trembling mass of prisoners. There was no pity in his eyes, only cold calculation. He understood. They cannot be released. They will take up arms again. Killing everyone is too simple and unpedagogical. He needs something more than the enemy's death. He needs terror that paralyzes the will of an entire nation for generations to come. It is here, in the shadow of the Balasica Mountains, that the very plan with the blinding, which we spoke of at the beginning, is born in his mind. But that will be tomorrow. And today, he is the victor. Basil returns to Constantinople not just as a winner. He returns as a demigod. For the first time in hundreds of years, Byzantium has no serious enemies on its borders. From the north, the silence of the dead. From the east, peace. The treasury is bursting with looted gold. It would seem live and rejoice, build temples, drink wine, write memoirs. But Basil does not know how to rejoice. His gaze is already seeking a new target. And he finds it not abroad, but right under his nose. He looks at the palaces of the Constantinopolitan nobility, at the fat, sleek aristocrats who, all this time while he slept in the snow and ate rusks, amassed fortunes, bought up the lands of poor soldiers, and wove intrigues. He remembers Trajan's Gate. He remembers their laughter. He remembers the rebellions of Phocas and Skleros. Now that external enemies are defeated, the emperor's hands are untied for the main war of his life, the war against his own elite. He intends to make the rich weep tears of blood, and his new weapon will be more terrible than a sword. It will be the tax code. Do you hear that sound? It is not the ringing of swords or the whistle of arrows. It is the gnashing of teeth. The loudest sound in Constantinople after the year 1014. While a dead silence reigned on the borders of the empire, a new war began inside the golden walls of the capital. A war without blood, but with total annihilation. Basil II returned home a victor, the Bulgar-Slayer, a living legend. It seemed like the time to relax, hold a triumph, distribute awards, and enjoy the flattery of court poets. But Basil looked at his retinue, at all these aristocrats dressed in silks and brocade,
and saw not subjects. He saw parasites. Remember, who betrayed him in his youth? Who laughed at him after Trajan's gate? Who raised rebellions trying to tear the crown off him? It wasn't Bulgarian shepherds or Arab emirs. It was the dinatoi, the powerful, the landed oligarchy of Byzantium, the Phokas, Skleros, Melenos clans, people whose estates rivaled small European kingdoms in size, and whose private armies could compete with the imperial guard. While Basil slept in tents and swallowed road dust for 30 years, these people bought up the lands of ruined peasant soldiers, turning the free warriors of the empire into their serfs. They grew fat on the war the emperor was waging. Basil realized. He destroyed the external enemy. Now it was time to deal with the internal enemy. He didn't start chopping heads. That's too crude and creates new martyrs. He decided to hit where the oligarchs have their soul, their wallet. In the year 10 and 2, and then rigidly reinforcing it after the victory over Bulgaria, Basil introduces a law whose name still causes historians of law to shudder. Alleluengion. In Greek, mutual responsibility. But in Basil's interpretation, it was a financial guillotine for the elite. The essence was brilliantly simple and monstrously unfair from the point of view of the rich. Formerly, if a peasant died, fled, or simply couldn't pay taxes, this debt was spread over the whole village. Neighbors paid for the neighbor. Basil flipped the board. Now, if a poor man couldn't pay tax, his rich landowner neighbor was obliged to pay for him. Just think about the beauty of this scheme. The emperor made the rich sponsors of the poor, forcibly. It was 11th century socialism enforced by the iron fist of an autocrat. The dinatoi howled. The patriarch protested, begging the emperor to repeal the godless law. Aristocrats wrote tearful petitions, pointing out that this was ruining ancient families. But Basil was deaf. He enjoyed their screams. He saw supreme justice in this. You want to own the empire's land? Pay for its maintenance. You want to live in luxury while my soldiers die in the snow? You will pay for their armor. Alleluengion worked like a perfect press. Huge fortunes began to melt. The rich, to pay taxes for beggar neighbors, were forced to sell their lands. To whom? Correct, to the state, or to those same free peasants. Basil killed two birds with one stone. He broke the spine of the independent aristocracy, depriving it of the economic base for rebellions, and simultaneously saved the class of stratiotes, peasant warriors, the foundation of his army. He acted like Robin Hood in reverse. He robbed the rich not to give to the poor, but to strengthen his absolute power. Imagine the atmosphere in the palace during these years. Fear. Sticky, cold fear under vaults painted with golden mosaics. Nobles bow at the emperor's feet, smile, kiss the hem of his purple robe, but in their eyes is hatred. They are afraid to show off wealth. Luxury becomes dangerous. Being rich under Basil II means being a target. Treasury inspectors scour the provinces like hounds sniffing out hidden income. Any peasant complaint against a feudal lord is considered by the court instantly, and almost always in favor of the peasant. Basil created a unique situation. The emperor became an idol for common soldiers and the rabble, and a nightmare for the elite. He intentionally isolated himself from his class. He didn't go to feasts, didn't hold lavish receptions, didn't maintain small talk. He turned into the stern father of the nation, who, with a stick in his hand, watches to make sure the children don't steal jam. "I am a poor man on the throne," he could have said, although so much gold accumulated in the cellars of his palace that the treasury had to be expanded to store it. 200,000 talents of gold, a sum for which one could buy half the known world. But this coin had a flip side. By destroying the elite, Basil destroyed the environment in which capable administrators could grow. He surrounded himself with executors, gray officials who were afraid to show initiative. Scorched earth formed around him. No one dared to object. No one dared to advise.
Everyone just nodded and rushed to execute the despot's will. He built a system centered on one person, on himself. And while the Dynatoi ground their teeth and hid the remains of gold in caches, dreaming of the day when the old ghoul would finally croak, Basil continued to work. He was sure he would live forever, or at least long enough to rebuild the world completely. But he forgot one small detail. An empire can have any amount of gold and soldiers, but a human has only one body. And this body is mortal. Having created the perfect mechanism of power, Basil didn't think about who would turn the handle of this mechanism after him. He was so busy with war and taxes that he forgot to marry, forgot to have a son, forgot to raise a successor. And in this ringing silence of the throne room, where everyone trembled before his gaze, the shadow of the coming catastrophe was already beginning to emerge. The greatest power of Byzantium hung by a single thread, the pulse of an aging emperor. And no one, not a single one of these aristocrats humiliated by him, was ready to pick up the falling banner. Loneliness at the top ceased to be a metaphor. It became a political sentence. Look at the map of the world in the year 1025. This is no longer just a state. It is a leviathan, spreading its tentacles across 3 continents. If you stand on the fortress wall in Ani, in the mountains of Armenia, you will see Byzantine banners. If you sail thousands of kilometers west to the sunny shores of southern Italy, you will see the same banners. The Danube, the Euphrates, the Caucasus Mountains, and the beaches of Crete. All this is now one giant monolithic system managed from one point. The Byzantine Empire has reached its historical zenith. It shines so brightly, it blinds the neighbor's eyes. In the cellars of the Great Palace in Constantinople lie 200,000 talents of gold. Try to imagine this mountain of metal. It's not just money. It is concentrated energy, capable of buying any army, building any fleet, bribing any barbarian king. It is the largest gold reserve in the Christian world. The treasury is bursting with taxes paid by intimidated oligarchs and trophies brought from burned Bulgarian cities. It seems this golden age will last forever. It seems God has finally smiled upon the Romans and granted them an eternal kingdom. But walk through the echoing corridors of the palace to the private chambers of the one who created all this, and you will feel not triumph, but the icy cold of a crypt. Here, in Spartan surroundings, sits an old man. He is 67 years old. For the Middle Ages, this is deep old age, an age when people have long been bouncing grandchildren on their knees by the fireplace and preparing to meet the Creator. But Basil II is not bouncing grandchildren. He has none. He is not preparing for death. He is preparing for a new war. His gaze is fixed on Sicily, an island seized by Arabs. It is a splinter in his heart, the last unfinished stroke on the map of his ambitions. The army is already gathered. The fleet lies at anchor in the Bosphorus, ready to sail. The old man checks maps, dictates orders, inspects weapons. He still sleeps on a hard bed, still wears simple clothes, still knows no fatigue. He is a perpetual motion machine. He convinced himself and those around him that he is immortal. He is Atlas holding up the sky, and he thinks it will always be so. But look closer. This Atlas stands in a frightening void. Basil II is the loneliest man on earth. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is a dry medical fact.
He has no wife. Never did. He refused marriage because he saw women only as a source of intrigue and weakness. He remembered his mother, Theophano, who changed husbands like gloves, killing emperors. He decided it was better to be alone than to sleep with an enemy. He has no mistresses. He has no friends. Everyone he once knew is either dead or turned into silent executors. The scariest thing, he has no children. And this is not an accident. It is a conscious choice that became his main crime against the future. Basil identified himself so much with the empire that he couldn't imagine anyone else sitting on his throne. A son for him would not be a continuator of the line, but a rival. He feared seeing in an heir's eyes the same impatience with which he once looked at usurpers. His paranoia, born in youth, crystallized over the years into absolute egocentrism. "The state is me," he could have said long before the French king. But if the state is you, then when you die, the state dies too. Next to him, in the shadow of his greatness, exists a ghost. His younger brother, Constantine VIII. He is also over 60. All his life he was a spare. While Basil swallowed dust on campaigns, Constantine drank wine, played dice, and had fun with dancers at the hippodrome. Basil despised his brother, considered him a non-entity, but didn't touch him. Constantine was convenient precisely because of his worthlessness. He posed no threat. He was furniture in the throne room. And it was this old hedonist who understood absolutely nothing about governance who was to accept the keys to the most powerful machine in the world. And even deeper, in the women's quarters of the palace, the Gynecium, Basil's nieces, Zoe and Theodora, are locked away. Women who are already over 40 but haven't seen life. Virgins of royal blood whom their uncle kept in a golden cage, forbidding them to marry. He feared their husbands would start claiming power. He canned the dynasty, turned his relatives into museum exhibits. He thought that this way he was protecting the throne from shocks. In reality, he was planting a time bomb under the throne. December 1025 was cold. The wind from the Bosphorus howled in the palace chimneys like a wounded animal. The emperor was preparing to lead the campaign to Sicily. He already saw himself entering Palermo. But instead of a battle trumpet, a wheeze sounded in his chest. The organism that had worked to its limit for 70 years suddenly said, "Stop." Illness felled the iron old man in a few days. On December 12th, 1025, Basil II died. At that moment, the history of Byzantium stopped. Imagine the silence that hung over Constantinople. It was not a silence of mourning. The people did not pity the stern ascetic who squeezed all the juice out of them with taxes. The elite did not pity the tyrant who humiliated them for decades. It was a silence of confusion and animal fear of the unknown. The giant mechanism of the empire froze. The gear wheels of bureaucracy, lubricated by fear of one man, stopped turning. The army, standing ready for the invasion of Sicily, lowered its swords. Without Basil's order, no one knew what to do, where to go, whom to kill, whom to protect. The manual control system lost its operator. Basil's body, this vessel of incredible will, was placed in a marble sarcophagus. But he bequeathed not to be buried in the imperial tomb of the Holy Apostles, next to great predecessors. He ordered himself to be laid in the monastery of St. John the Theologian, in the suburbs where the cavalry trained. Even after death, he wanted to hear the tramping of hooves and the neighing of horses. He wanted to remain a soldier. On his grave, an epitaph was written in which he proudly listed his victories over the children of Hagar, and Scythians. Not a word about peace, not a word about prosperity, only war. He left, leaving behind an empire of steel and gold, perfectly protected borders, an overflowing treasury, submissive neighbors. It would seem, what could go wrong? But Basil made the fatal mistake of any dictator. He believed that order is maintained by fear, not by institutions. He did not build a system of checks and balances. He did not raise an elite capable of thinking like statesmen. He left the country to people whose will had been amputated. The moment the lid of the sarcophagus slammed shut, the golden age of Byzantium ended. The countdown began. The keys to an empire full of treasures fell into the mud, and the trembling, ring-bedecked hand of Constantine VIII was already reaching for them. And behind his back, in the dark corners of the palace, those who had waited for this moment for half a century were already sharpening their knives. The vultures smelled carrion. The era of great creation was replaced by the era of great squandering. The doors to hell swung open, and the first to step there were not enemies, but heirs. Imagine you were standing at a dam. For 50 years, Basil II built this wall of stone, iron, and fear, holding back chaos. And now imagine that someone simply opened the sluices, but instead of water, gold gushed out. 200,000 talents accumulated by the ascetic burst the dam of prudence and flooded Constantinople. The most grandiose and senseless feast in history began. The empire, which just yesterday was a military camp, turned into a brothel overnight. Constantine VIII clambered onto the throne. If Basil was a steel blade, his brother was a soft pillow embroidered with gold. 65 years he waited for this moment. 65 years he accumulated grievances and unrealized desires. And now the old hedonist decided he had little time left, so he had to live fast. The palace filled with noise that made the mosaics of saints tremble. Wine flowed like a river, dice clattered on tables, and state affairs were decided between courses and dancers' performances. Constantine did not know how to govern. He only knew how to spend and punish. But if Basil's cruelty was a surgical scalpel cutting out the tumor of rebellion, Constantine's cruelty was the whim of a sadist. He blinded people simply because he had a headache or had a bad dream. Suspicion became the main state policy. Any talented general, any popular official immediately fell into disgrace. Why are heroes needed? Heroes are dangerous. Empires need lackeys, and the lackeys came. Like cockroaches crawling out of cracks at the sight of crumbs, eunuchs, flatterers, and parasites of all stripes were drawn to the court. They surrounded the decrepit emperor in a tight ring, whispering what he wanted to hear. And the first thing they demanded was the repeal of Alleluyengion, the very law that forced the rich to pay for the poor. Constantine, without looking, signed the decree. It was the sound of the empire's spine snapping. The landed aristocracy, which Basil had held in check for half a century, broke loose from its chain. The revenge of the oligarchs began. They pounced on peasant lands with the appetite of hungry wolves. Free stratiotes, ploughman warriors, the backbone of the army, were ruined by the thousands. Their lands were bought for pennies, and they themselves were turned into farm laborers. But who in the palace cared about some soldiers? Constantinople was in a euphoria of consumption. Basil's gold was spent on building useless palaces, buying exotic animals, silks, and incense. The capital was rotting alive, but the smell of rot was drowned out by the scents of Arabian perfumes. When Constantine died 3 years later, leaving the empire to his daughters, the farce turned into a tragedy. Zoe and Theodora, two elderly women who had spent their whole lives in the golden cage of the Gynoeceum, suddenly found themselves rulers of the world. Zoe, who was already over 50, desperately tried to make up for lost youth. She turned the throne room into an alchemist's laboratory, where she brewed rejuvenating creams, and into a marriage agency. A game of musical chairs with husbands began. Emperors changed like gloves. Romanos Argyros, Michael the Paphlagonian, Michael Calaphates, Constantine Monomachos. Random people, favorites, pretty boys, intriguers. The purple robe became bed linen. But the most terrible crime was committed not in the Empress's bedroom, but in the ministers' offices. The civil party came to power. Bureaucrats, learned scribes, the metropolitan intelligentsia, like Michael Psellos. These people were brilliantly educated, but absolutely blind politically. They hated the army. They feared military coups more than external enemies. They remembered how generals like Phocas and Skleros, and even Basil himself, kept the city in fear. And they came up with what seemed to them a brilliant plan. So the army wouldn't rebel. There shouldn't be an army. The conscious, systematic dismantling of the military machine began. It was like a man selling his lungs to buy new shirts. Funding for the fleet was cut to zero. Ships rotted in harbors, sails turned to rags. Thematic armies in the provinces were disbanded. Veterans were fired without pensions, replaced by mercenaries. The logic was murderous. Why maintain your own soldiers who might rebel if you can hire Varangians, Franks, or Pechenegs? Mercenaries are loyal as long as you pay them. And then they went even further. They decided that fighting wasn't necessary at all. Why do we need steel if we have gold? These intellectuals in silk robes reasoned. They began to pay off enemies. When Pechenegs or Seljuks attacked the borders, they simply sent caravans of tribute. Checkbook diplomacy. It worked for a year, 2, 10. Enemies took the money, laughed, and left, only to return the next year and ask for more. The empire turned into a cash cow that no one guarded. The defense system Basil had built for decades collapsed like a house of cards. Fortresses on the borders emptied. Signal fires were not lit. Locals, seeing that Constantinople had abandoned them, stopped resisting invaders. Why die for an emperor who spends your taxes on lovers, not walls? Patriotism died along with hope. In this atmosphere of general decomposition, where corruption became the only working social elevator and betrayal the norm of ethics, the empire was rapidly flying into the abyss. But the fall was soft, like jumping onto a feather bed. In the capital, music still played. Baths worked. Philosophical circles discussed the nature of light, and the stands roared at the hippodrome. They didn't want to see the clouds gathering in the east. They didn't want to notice that a new, terrifying enemy, the Seljuk Turks, was already at the gates. The Seljuks were not just another group of raiders. They were a young, hungry, passionate force, driven by jihad and a thirst for living space. They tested the border and, to their surprise, found it soft. Where Basil's iron legions once stood, there was now a void. In the year 1068, when the situation became critical, a man ascended the throne who tried to stop this decay. Romanos IV Diogenes, a soldier to the bone. He looked at what the great army had turned into and was horrified. But he had no time for reforms. The enemy had already crossed the line. He had to assemble what was left, a rabble of mercenaries, ruined peasants, and unreliable allies, and lead them east. He went to save an empire that had already sold itself. He went to meet his fate at a small Armenian town called Manzikert. August 1071, Eastern Anatolia, the Manzikert Plateau. Here the air is thin and dry, and the sun burns the eyes. Look at this field. It looks like a giant chessboard on which God decided to play out the finale of the Byzantine tragedy. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes is here, and he knows this is his last chance. He is not a politician, he is a soldier. He understands only the language of steel. When he ascended the throne, he saw the empire looked like a rotting corpse being pecked by vultures. He tried to resuscitate the army, but instead of Basil II's iron legions, he got a rabble. Look at his troops. It is a patchwork quilt sewn with rotten threads. Pechenegs, Oghuz, Franks, Normans, Armenians, Georgians. Mercenaries fighting for money, not an idea. Many of them don't understand orders in Greek. The Oghuz look just like the Seljuk Turks, wear the same clothes, speak the same language. How do you tell friend from foe in the dust of battle? Romanos Diogenes trusts no one. He knows they hate him in Constantinople. The Ducas clan, those bureaucrats in silk robes, dream of him stumbling. They sent Andronikos Ducas with him on the campaign, the eldest son of their leader, officially as an assistant, in reality as an overseer and executioner. On August 19th, the two armies clashed. Sultan Alp Arslan, the valiant lion, did not want this battle. He offered peace. But Romanos refused. What peace can there be with wolves tearing your sheep? The emperor wanted to throw the Turks out of Anatolia once and for all. He drew up his troops in classic battle order. He himself stood in the center. In the rear, in reserve, he placed Andronikos Ducas. It was a fatal decision. Trusting his back to someone who dreams of stabbing a knife into it. The battle began in the afternoon. The Byzantine heavy cavalry, clad in armor, moved forward. The ground shook. The Turks, light horsemen on fast steeds, did not accept a direct blow. They scattered like mercury. They retreated, showering the Romans with clouds of arrows. It was an old steppe tactic. Lure, stretch the formation, exhaust. Romanos knew this, but he drove his horse forward. He needed to reach the Sultan's camp, force close combat, where his heavy infantry and cavalry would have the advantage. They advanced for several hours. The heat was hellish. Men and horses suffocated in clouds of dust. By evening, the Byzantines captured the Sultan's camp, but it was empty. The enemy vanished, dissolved into the twilight, continuing to circle and sting with arrows. The sun was setting. Romanos realized that spending the night in an open field, without water, surrounded by elusive archers, was madness. He made a decision that any military textbook would call correct, but which that day became a death sentence. He ordered the standard to be turned, the signal for an organized retreat to their fortified camp. The imperial standard swung and turned back. To the Turkish observers, it looked like a rout. Alp Arslan ordered an attack with all forces. Waves of Seljuks crashed onto the Byzantine flanks. A chaotic melee began. In this critical moment, everything depended on the reserve. Andronikos Ducas, standing on a hill with elite regiments, saw everything. He saw that the emperor was not running, but retreating in an organized manner. He saw the enemy pressing on the flanks. It was his duty, his sacred oath, to strike, cover the retreat, throw back the Turks. One attack by the fresh reserve would have been enough to save the situation. But Andronikos Ducas did something that no soldier can comprehend. He shouted loudly, so everyone around could hear, "The emperor is defeated! Save yourselves!" And he turned his regiments around. He didn't just leave. He led the reserve away from the battlefield, leaving his sovereign to be torn apart. It was not cowardice. It was cold-blooded political murder, committed by the hands of the enemy. The Byzantine army, seeing the reserve leaving, panicked. The right flank, consisting of Oghuz mercenaries, immediately switched to the Turkish side. The left flank crumbled. The Armenians ran. The center, where the emperor was, ended up in a ring. Romanos IV was left alone. A sea of enemies tightened around him, while his own generals galloped away, taking with them the hope of saving the empire. It was a scene of epic scale and epic tragedy. The emperor, betrayed by his own, fought like a lion. His horse was killed under him. He stood up, drew his sword, and continued to fight on foot. He knew he would die, but he wanted to sell his life dearly. Faithful guards fell around him until he himself was wounded in the arm and fell under the weight of enemies piling on him. When the dust settled, the unthinkable happened. The Emperor of the Romans, God's vice-regent on earth, lay in the mud, bound, at the feet of a barbarian sultan. Alp Arslan couldn't believe his eyes. He asked the prisoner, "What would you do to me if I were in chains before you?" Romanos, spitting blood, answered with grim honesty, "I would have whipped you or killed you." The Sultan laughed, "And I will punish you more terribly. I will forgive you and let you go." The Sultan showed more nobility toward the captive emperor than his own subjects. But the Battle of Manzikert became a catastrophe not because of military losses. The army was not physically destroyed, most simply scattered or left with the traitors. Manzikert killed the myth of the empire's invincibility. It broke the moral backbone of the nation. The worst thing happened not on the battlefield, but in the minds. The Byzantines realized that their elite was ready to sell the country, the army, and the emperor for power. Ducas's betrayal opened the gates Basil II had locked for 50 years. Anatolia, the heart of the empire, its breadbasket, source of horses and soldiers, was left defenseless. The Turks didn't even have to storm cities. They simply walked into open doors while people fought for the throne in Constantinople. Romanos Diogenes, released by the Sultan, would try to regain power, but a fate awaited him compared to which death in battle would seem like mercy. Byzantium signed its own death warrant, and the ink on it was mixed with the blood of patriots and the poison of traitors. Sultan Alp Arslan kept his word. He gave Romanos IV Diogenes gold, guards, and freedom. Imagine this surreal picture. A defeated emperor galloping home to restore order again, believing his people are waiting for him. He believed honor still meant something in Constantinople. What naivety. Romanos didn't understand that he was returning not to a home, but to a terrarium where he had already been sentenced. While he was a prisoner, the Ducas clan declared him deposed. His wife Eudokia was sent to a monastery, and Michael VII was put on the throne, a weak-willed youth interested only in books and sophistry. When Romanos crossed the border, he was met not with flowers, but with swords. A short, dirty civil war began. Yesterday's hero, the only man trying to save the country, was declared an enemy of the state. He was cornered in Cilicia. He was promised immunity. They swore on the cross and the gospel that if he surrendered and became a monk, not a single hair would fall from his head. 3 metropolitans acted as guarantors, and Romanos, that honest soldier, believed again. He laid down his arms. What happened next will forever remain an indelible stain on Byzantium's conscience. As soon as Romanos was in the hands of his political opponents, all oaths were forgotten. The order came from Constantinople, from that very Michael Psellos, the great philosopher and humanist. Deprive of light. A bureaucratic formulation for an act of extreme cruelty. Romanos was brought to a fortress.
The executioner was inexperienced or intentionally cruel. He blinded the former emperor with red-hot iron, not once, but 4 times, turning his face into one continuous wound. It was not punishment. It was slow murder. Romanos, blind, in hellish pain, was put on a mule and taken across the whole country to a monastery on the island of Proti. His wounds festered. Worms infested them. The smell of rotting flesh was so strong that servants could not approach him. The man who just yesterday commanded legions died in total darkness, loneliness, and unbearable agony, begging God for death as deliverance. He passed away in the summer of 1072. Byzantium killed its last defender with a cruelty even the Turks disdained. And while the Romans enthusiastically slaughtered each other and gouged out their emperor's eyes, something irreversible was happening in the east. The doors kicked open at Manzikert remained wide open. No one went to close them. The army was busy with civil war. Garrisons were removed from fortresses to fight against Romanos. Anatolia, a huge sunny plateau, the heart of the empire, the place where bread was grown and the best soldiers recruited for centuries, emptied. And into this void poured a flood. Turkic tribes no longer raided. They migrated. They came in whole families, with herds of sheep, with wagons, with wives and children. They met no resistance. Cities opened their gates because there was no one to defend them, and the Sultan's taxes seemed less predatory than the taxes of Constantinople officials. Locals, tired of the endless chaos and corruption of the capital, looked at the newcomers not as enemies, but as a new power that could at least bring order. In 10 years, Byzantium lost what it had been building for 1,000 years. The map was repainted. Where liturgies in Greek once sounded, muezzins now sang. Anatolia turned into Turkey, the Sultanate of Rum. The empire lost its lungs, its blood, its spine. Without Anatolian resources and people, Constantinople turned into a huge head on a rickety body. It was simply living out its days. The agony would last for centuries. There would still be bursts of activity under the Komnenoi, but it would be a struggle for survival, not for dominance. The fatal blow was struck not by a scimitar, but by a treacherous knife in the back in its own home. And now, standing on the ruins of a great era, let's return to the one with whom it all began, to Basil II. To our Bulgar-Slayer. We walked with him through icy passes, through bloody battles, through triumph and greatness. We saw how he forged an empire out of steel and fear. But looking at the blinded, rotting alive Romanos Diogenes, looking at the hordes of nomads grazing sheep on the ruins of Byzantine villas, we must admit a terrible truth. The collapse of the empire is not the fault of weak heirs, it is Basil's fault. This is the paradox of power against which the greatest civilizations have shattered. Basil built a perfect vertical. He centered absolutely everything on himself. He burned out any initiative, any independence, any alternative around him. He created a system that could only work if a genius, workaholic, and ascetic, working 24 hours a day, stood at the helm. He created a Formula One car, but didn't train drivers. He left the steering wheel to people who only knew how to drive a donkey cart. His tragedy is the tragedy of absolute loneliness and absolute pride. He loved the empire so much that he strangled it in his embrace. He thought he was making the state strong by destroying the aristocracy, but he destroyed the society's immune system. When the Titan left, pygmies remained, and the pygmies could not hold up the sky he left them. All that accumulated gold reserve, all that drilled army, all that fear of Byzantium, everything vanished in one generation because the foundation of it all was not a system of institutions, not the law, but the will of one mortal man. Basil II won all the battles but lost the war against time. He left behind a monument that turned out to be a tombstone. His life is a cruel lesson of history. Stability based on the dictatorship of one person is illusory. Power unsupported by continuity is fragility. He wanted to be the savior of the nation, but became the architect of its collapse. He blinded 15,000 Bulgarians to intimidate enemies, but in the end, he blinded the empire itself, which ceased to see the abyss beneath its feet. The history of Byzantium after Basil is the long, painful exhalation of a dying man. It is a chronicle of missed opportunities and squandered greatness. But in this darkness, there is also an evil irony. The empire fell not because it was weak. It fell because it was too strongly tied to one man who decided that he was the empire. And now, look into the mirror of history. Ask yourself the question that should sound like an alarm bell in the head of everyone who seeks power or chooses those who rule. What is more important? A strong hand that solves all problems today but leaves a scorched field behind? Or a complex, slow, annoying system of checks that prevents society from collapsing into chaos when the leader leaves? Are you ready to pay for your country's greatness with your children's future? After all, Basil II made his choice. And the price of that choice was 1,500 years of oblivion for a civilization that considered itself eternal. And what choice would you make?